Thank you very much. We begin with a discussion, and Bishop Marcelo would like to speak first.
I am very interested in your considerations, especially with the question of the Muslim and the reaction. And it's very interesting to observe the different reaction of the very old countries that have a very old relation with the Muslims. Your country is one, you know the invasion of your country for the Ottoman Empire, and the Spanish people that have for 70 centuries the Muslims in this country. And what is this different? What is this different today attitude against to this I don't say the people, because the people is very well, but this ideology of have some kind of impaired, we can say.
You see, on the one hand, just from the point of view of political science, what is going on the West is also regarded as the second wave of decolonization. So once Belgians were in Africa, then they withdraw from Africa. They came back to Belgium. This is the first wave of decolonization. Then the people from Rwanda and Congo are coming to Belgium. That's the second wave. We had never colonies. And this is this fact that when we are talking on this multicultural population, that's just people who were living there for centuries. Some of them came in a certain moment. That's, for example, the Armenian community and so on. On the other hand, in the case of Poland, what was very specific, that the first voice against the acceptance of Muslim migrants was produced by the Polish Muslim community. So they were afraid of radicalization, because in the 90s, they were coming Muslims from Saudi Arabia saying to this Polish community, "You are not good Muslims." They were taking them to Saudi Arabia for re-education. And this stopped only with the intervention, this was 1993, with the intervention of Polish Ministry for Foreign Affairs. In the case of Poland, before any politicians took the word, there was a statement produced by the Muslim community in Poland that they are so well integrated that they don't want to change this. In the case of Slovakia, for example, you have the argument that we don't have mosque. So what does it mean? If we don't have an Arabic population, also in the police, there are no people trained for this, to deal with this kind of problems. I spoke with a minister from Slovenia who said, we have all over Slovenia 40,000 people in all kinds of uniforms. And today came to Slovenia 200,000 migrants. If they would remain for a few days, we wouldn't be able to control the situation. But Austria has not closed the border. So they survived. When I spoke in Hungary, during a conference, a minister responsible for these issues said to send 100,000 of migrants to Budapest was an attempt to change the government in Hungary. And there were different reasons used in different countries. I'm just saying that there is also this historical reasons that we saved Europe of Islam 300 centuries ago. And this was the last big battle we won before the loss of independence. The loss of independence was a cost of this battle at Vienna. Certainly when you are in Warsaw, today, on the one hand, in every shop, working people there are speaking among themselves in Ukrainian. On the streets, you have also Muslims. But that's not a very big number of them coming, but in Warsaw there is, I think, 15 places of prayer for Muslims. 30 years ago there was only one. So you have on the one hand the political talk. On the other hand, you have the facts. In the political debate, the most important for the Polish, for the opposition at that time, and now the Polish government, was that the decision cannot be taken by the EU, so there can be not imposition on the countries, because once it was not a problem at that time to take some thousands of migrants. But they were using the argument, once we agree on this, that the Brussels can send to every country a certain number of migrants, we will never stop this. We will lose the competence. This was the main argument used by the opposition then.
Thank you. You want to talk first? Yeah? Thank you, Piotr. As we know, there are two basic notions of identity. Identity for recognition and to be recognized, and that is the notion which goes back to Plato, when Plato talks about timos, and he says timos is a fundamental need of human beings. Everybody wants to be recognized by others. The second notion is identity in order to maintain certain position of interest or position which can help a smaller community to take advantage. That is why in certain quarters people claim for identity because that allows them to obtain, for instance, a position in universities, in the bureaucracy, etc. Now, according to you, in the case of Central Europe, in particular your country, Poland, which one of the two notions is dominant? Because as you can imagine, the strategy to cope with these problems are different. Because in one case, one population, one people could claim identity to preservation of identity because they need to be recognized. In another case, because they want to maintain certain position of advantage. And so in this second case, the strategy to be pursued if we want to obtain the final goal of peace or common good are different.
Certainly both elements you can find, but I would stress two other elements. One which is mentioned by John Paul II in Memory and Identity. He's saying that there is a debt toward a community which formed us. So there is a duty. And the Pope is saying, once in the history, we have not fulfilled this duty, losing the state. So, but this is, I think, also in St. Thomas' understanding of patriotism, you have this these words: "Maxime est homo debitur parentibus et patria." So this understanding of the debt is very important in the communities which have the feeling that they could disappear, and that this risk still is, even if the reasons are changing. And on the other hand, there was the question of being at home. So we celebrated last year in most of the Central European countries 100th anniversary of independence. Some states for the first time appeared 100 years ago, or the recuperation of independence. And from this 100 years, 50 years, that was the German occupation or Soviet occupation. And what does it mean? That one of the biggest problems after the end of communism was to convince people that the state is not an enemy, that this is our state. And that a part of this mentality in Central Europe was that we are always under foreign power. So to be at home, that's very important. And this is called, in my country, a Republican tradition, which is linked directly with the name of the country. Poland never used the word Polish Republic. We used a Polish word which means exactly res publica. It means the common affair, something for what people are responsible together. And for this preservation of the house where you are at home, that's a part also of this identity. So if you have a very high position, you can try to build identity just preserving this position.
Other questions that may be for John and for Janne. I would say that seems fair. But I would ask you to answer a little bit more briefly so that we have a chance to give then also questions to the other speakers of this afternoon. Please, Rocco.
Well, Professor Mazurkiewicz, I want to thank you very much for having let us hear the spirit, the words of Polish liberty. I remember John Paul II once said that the voice of the Slav peoples must resonate in the cenacle of the nations today, and you did something very similar to what you wanted. Thank you. However, there is the story of Polish liberty. Paweł Wódkowicz, plus ratio quam vis, in the period of the Inquisition in Poland, even before the Spanish Inquisition, in Poland somebody said, you must convert the heathen, the pagans, through the force of reason to preaching, not through violence. Nevertheless, that's not all the history of Poland, because Polishmen too are sinners, stand under the original sin like other peoples. And there is an history of the great Jagiellonian Republic, the Rzeczpospolita, but there is also the history of the prevarication of the Poles against the Ruthenians, the rebellion of the Ruthenians, the Cossacks, Khmelnytsky, and the dissolution in the end of the Rzeczpospolita. And there is also a tradition of Polish anti-Semitism and of Polish nationalism in the wrong sense of the word, not just the love of the country. And I completely agree with you. Poland has been treated very badly, like all Eastern countries. They arrived and had something to give to us, the discovery of fundamental European values in the resistance to communism. I think also of Jan Patočka. I remember the seminars of Patočka on Plato and Europe, underground seminar, the underground university in Krakow with Marek Szwarnicki and so forth. So this heritage, this cultural heritage, has been belittled and refused. But don't you think that there has been also a kind of an overreaction in Poland? And I have the impression that some of my Polish friends have become crazy. They have good reasons to become crazy. They have been offended, and under the offense, one has a good reason to become crazy. But nevertheless, are not they going too far and running the risk of a nationalism in the bad sense of the word, in the sense that caused the rebellion of the Cossacks, in the sense condemned by Piotr Skarga in his homilies against Polish szlachta, the Polish nobility. And I understand if we go to Poland and preach the vague humanitarianism of the West, this only makes things worse. But what can be done to bring them back to the true great tradition of Polish freedom?
You see, certainly the history was not perfect also concerning the Polish customs, and I see the dissolution of the Polish Commonwealth, which started with the fact when the Ruthenians nobility was not treated exactly the same way as Lithuanians and Poles. So that they were promised that if they will enter into the Union, so they will have exactly the same rights. And this process of granting them rights started well, but in a certain moment they stopped. And this is the beginning of the dissolution and of this option of Khmelnytsky. I think that this is a very important lesson for Poles, but not only for Poles. That whenever we are willing to create this multinational community, we have to respect everyone, even if some communities can be weaker. If not, this will destroy with time the whole community. We have this experience. So whenever we are looking on the history and culture, and this was stressed also by John Paul II, there is a mystery of piety, mysterium pietatis in the culture, and mysterium iniquitatis. And trying to understand our own past and our own culture, we have to see both elements and to take the position on this. And the other thing is concerning the Polish democracy, because Poland was the unique in Europe democratic country at that time. This was the biggest country in Europe at that time, and the only one which was democratic, with around 20% of the inhabitants who had political rights. But in a certain moment, there was no one to fight for freedom. So there was, as in the Plato description in the 8th book of the Republic, that if there is too much of freedom, there is no one to defend the freedom. Concerning the
the equal treatment of all nationalities in Poland. As the chair of this session, I have a duty to give equal time to everybody. But now Pierpaolo can speak. We are already in the general session. However, within the general session, of course, Pierpaolo has the right to ask whomever he wants, including the last speaker. This is compatible with my strong sense of procedural justice. Please, Pierpaolo.
Thank you for this privilege, which is to start the general session, and I wouldn't take profit of that. I wanted to start by asking the last speaker, Piotr, a question. Your paper was an excellent paper. You exposed the very noble Polish tradition of what we can call a cultural national identity founded on religion. But the question is that how long can it go on in face of a very different scenario for the next decades? And I see that there are two big challenges to the national identity in the cultural sense you meant. In a cultural identity like the Polish one, where religion is at the core of this identity itself. And the two challenges are, first of all, the weakening of the differences. These are the two questions. The weakening of the differences between Catholicism and the Orthodoxy in the East and the Lutheran Church in the West. Because as far as I know, the issue for Poland was to be squeezed between the Orthodoxy in the East and the Lutheran Church. Now that the differences are becoming weaker and weaker, they are loosening in a way. What do you think about the possibility of retaining and preserving and strengthening the national identity you talked about? And the second force, the second challenge is, of course, globalization. Not in terms of ideology, but consumption, secularization. As far as I know, I mean, having been in Krakow and Warsaw, there, you notice the difference, because in Krakow, globalization, consumption, the market is already everywhere. The feeling I had is that globalization is arriving in Poland, and possibly this is contrary to the communist ideology, which was, of course, strong, but very much identifiable in its mistakes. The secularization is much more difficult to combat.
Father Piotr, you have 1 minute. The reason is that we want also to discuss the final declaration of the Academy, and we have to do it till before 6 o'clock, because between 6 and 7, then there is a closed meeting only of the members of the Academy. And so you have 1 minute to answer the complex question of Professor Donati.
I don't know the answer, but I think it's very important that if we will not take care for those identities, we will have conflicts in Europe. Not only in Central Europe, but in France, in Finland, in the Netherlands. That's the reality. And that's what I can say in 1 minute.